purging is at last at hand. The day of doom is here. All that is evil, all that are lies, your parents, your ears, those who would call themselves your judges, those who have lied and corrupted the earth, they shall all be cleansed.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day, whatever time you are tuning in for this podcast. Thank you for being here. Our man in Bangladesh on off is currently in Bangladesh. So today I have a very special guest with me. You're stuck with me and Tom Kawczynski. For once upon a time, he was the most hated man in Maine. He, like me, has since mellowed, and now we're here to talk about the history of early Christianity and what to expect in 2026, as well as anything else we wind up talking about. Good day, Tom.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it as always. And I don't know how much I've mellowed out. I mean, I'm trying to separate evangelicals from Zionism. That probably won't be treated well.
One of my big pet peeves. It's like, for the record, I would not support blowing up the Third Temple, the Sikh Golden Temple, or any historical building. But that's because of my ethics. My theology has nothing to do with it. From a theological statement, as a Christian, it doesn't matter to us. You can put up a third temple. You can put up a fourth temple. You can put up a shopping mall there. That has nothing to do with Christianity. We have a third temple. It's Christ who died and was reborn. That was the temple being rebuilt in Christian theology, or real Christian theology.
Well, I agree with you. I've been working on the better part of this year, doing a translation of a number of New Testament and several Old Testament, and even a few of the Coptic texts with a little bit of help from some AI, just on some of the difficult words, because it's one of those funny things where the Coptic texts were originally in Greek. So if you can read Greek, you can kind of tell what they're saying a lot better than you would normally be able to if it wasn't a translated work. But in any case, the point is, I've been studying the old texts. I've been studying them in the Greek. And I tell you what I think. I actually do have an issue with the Third Temple as a Christian. But I have an issue with it because I think I know what it is. It's the abomination of desolation. And I'll tell you why it means that. If you try to put God back in a place where his presence has left, because Kanaz is right, absolutely. The third temple is within us through the Comforter, that's the Holy Spirit. Then you are directly going against the will of God. And when you start calling that your good, you're doing evil. And it's not surprising when you look at the behavior, especially of the people closest to the Zionist project, that you end up with these sort of outcomes. And it doesn't matter if they're Jewish or if they're Christian or whatever. It is really easy to see who the bad guys are in this, as whole generations have seen, not in terms of news stories, but as terms of death seen in real time on their cameras and on their phones. And this is the reality we live in now. We are going into a new age of faith, I think, because faith in this world and in the institutions that exist, how can we have it? I mean, your show does an excellent job covering all the different corruption. I'll give you a harder challenge. Tell me someone this side of Nayib Bukele who seems like he's doing a half-decent job.
Sure. In terms of like a half-decent job, you mean in politically speaking? We're ruled by idiots.
Yeah, I mean, politically, or even, to be honest with you, I mean, if you start looking across any institutions, who's out there that is, to use the old Trumpism, they're not giving us their best. We, at this point, are getting third-rate rejects for leadership, and it really leads you to kind of wonder, are we this far gone, or is it just that there is a schism and maybe some group is trying to survive by getting rid of all the people who would be in the way? I mean, I don't know the answer to it, and I don't want to be conspiratorial about it. It could be as simple as, you just have a class interest. And if your class hangs out at places like Davos and Jackson Hole, you see the world differently.
I mean, I think one of the problems we have is the same problem that we saw when you look at the writing in the late Roman Empire. There's no really great philosophy going on anymore. There's no great engineering. In fact, we're getting pretty much to the point where they were, where they no longer knew how to, never mind build new aqueducts. They no longer even remembered how to maintain the old ones.
Yeah, it turned
And
out the most predictive movie of the last 50 years was Idiocracy. Go figure.
yeah, no, it's like that's, I mean, I think part of the problem we have, and part of the reason we see so much desperation for a strong leader, is the fact that, you know, deep down, a lot of us have come to realize there's not a strong enough leader out there to save us from like decades of stupid ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that either. It's also the misplaced elites thing. This is the first time in history where mechanical power was sufficient to actually displace, with a little bit of help from immigration, um, the middle class is ability and need to have goods. I mean, look at the last 10 years. We don't even have to be esoteric. The impoverishment by multiple policies, whether you want to look at the way that the Fed bailed out big businesses versus small businesses during COVID, whether you want to look at the financing restrictions. There's 100 different ways you could look at it, but every incentive and disincentive, not just in the United States, but throughout the entire Anglosphere and much of Western Europe, was set in a direction to destroy this part of the world. It took agency away from generations of men, and it also encouraged generations of women to work in jobs that ended up being a lot like social welfare. And it put everyone in a position then where nobody had families because women were following their biological imperative to seek someone who is a higher mate, who makes more money as the surrogate, and who is in a higher status. At the same time that the same people running society took all those men and forced them into what were deemed low status occupations. And as you look at some of these sort of patterns, you can't help but conclude it was either suicide by stupidity or suicide with assistance.
I mean, I think I've generally tried to avoid conspiracy theory because, A, because like the very nature of conspiracy makes it difficult to prove, and B, the people that are most enthusiastic about conspiracy theories, you're not going to talk them out of their theory of choice. But it is kind of like, I know never attribute to, like, malice what you could attribute to stupidity, but stupidity's been playing an awful long game here.
Yeah, I mean the idiocy is utterly insane, right? And it seems to have been very well coordinated. This isn't just individual bad actors. I mean, this is a real confederacy of dunces.
Yeah, I think one of the problems we also ran into is our bureaucratic class is shielded more than Versailles was. I mean, the people we have in power aren't really accountable to anybody. They don't have to know anything. They just have to, know the right people and spout the right slogans.
Well, I've been thinking about that. You make an excellent point, and it seems like to the extent there's any power in the political classes, it's in the subterfuge they play against one another in the blackmail games, like Epstein and whatnot, where we know certain players will always be protected, and other people are just fighting not to be listed as expendable. But let's pretend we looked at the whole system differently. I'm really going to try to do this next year, and it's not going to be easy, and Lord knows it's not going to get a lot of attention, but it needs to be done. We need to look at the world in terms of who holds the purse strings. If you look at the banks that own the sovereign debt the connections between the banks and the policies. So instead of looking at the world as being sovereign nations, you looked at it as a series of branch offices. I wonder how much more effective that would prove in explaining what's happening, because then you could link it to power production, resource extraction, the sort of hard power analysis that I know you guys get into. And if you did it through the banks, I suspect patterns would begin to emerge that make a lot more sense. And maybe the heat that was needed would go on people who can control policy decisions. Like, for instance, I was seeing that the Fed was making some of its biggest repo buys that it had made since COVID. And a lot of people speculated it was because of the issues with the silver market, and specifically with a short issue involving JP Morgan. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I do know the silver prices continue to spike. And I know, like anyone who studied the commodity markets, the paper value and the spot value are nowhere near one another. They never are. They never have been. And it's kind of one of those derivative type games finance plays. But this is where we are suffering, because the global story, and we should talk about some of the geostrategy. I want to talk about Venezuela because it's interesting. But if you start talking to people, and I have a pretty good network down in Latin America at this point for reasons that have nothing to do with politics, the story is inflation. It's inflation everywhere. It's an economy that is pricing out humanity. And that's got to be the story of 2026, because as you see more agitation and costs rise because of breakdowns and efficiencies in the global market, as new markets start up, tariffs, military spending, whatever these things are, they all add into this. The fact is, people are going to reach a point where survivability is going to be the question in terms of meeting basic needs, and that those are the fights they're going to have. And when that happens and they go after the governments, if they accept a financing system that's set up for them, then isn't that the culmination of every fear that every conspiracy theorist has had since Art Bell was on shortwave?
Yeah. I mean, I think we are coming into a time where we've been playing hot potato with our debt, with our with our declining resources, with our declining infrastructure. We've been playing hot potato, tossing it desperately to the next administration, to the next election cycle, hoping, okay, if only we can just keep things from falling completely apart till after the election is over. And I think it's becoming clear to a lot of people that, you know, there's no getting out of this. Sooner or later, you've got the silver market. I do notice geopolitically, China cutting off exports of silver or making it much harder to export silver. I mean, China, I am certain the Chinese are well aware of how badly they can wreck the West by simply cutting off certain exports.
Oh, and there's no doubt of that. And you see those fights already happening, going to the massive decoupling that's happening. But China doesn't have the stout economy people think either. They are basically, you had an engine that was running smooth until it hits COVID. After COVID, it's not running smooth, and whether you were an input or an output in that global supply engine. And China, I would rather be in China's shoes, absolutely, being the producer who has the goods. But the world works funny sometimes, and even the Chinese would love to be able to manage people through debt, because ultimately, having something that's immaterial in some ways is a better bond than something that's material, because once you solve a material need, you can get past it. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's the way the game works, and I guess that's the interesting part too. Narratives break down when loyalties have different meaning. People do not live as nationals anymore. They don't even live as global personalities. I almost think they live in the ecosystem of whatever social media sphere.
The
Or
media sphere. That's exactly it. They create their identity and they establish their team membership by spouting the right slogans. That's all it really is at this point. It's like, okay, do I share the right memes? Do I say, oh my God, Trump is the greatest, Trump is the worst, whatever. Do I say, like, I love, trans women or women? No, trans women or whatever it is, you have this whole system, this whole, you know, ecosystem of slogans. It's not even really political beliefs. It's more like, if I shout this, I mark myself as a good person, and my friends think I'm a good person. My
But I
friends,
think
of
I think
course,
it's
are
even I
on.
think it's even more profound than that, right? Because I don't disagree with you for the platforms that we would think of, like, maybe we would think of Twitter, X, whatever. Some of us use Telegram. Some people like to use Discord. Some people still use Gab, I presume. But then you start getting into the ones that are more fem coded, like somewhere like Instagram. And there it's a visual fight. And it's interesting. It's really interesting to see who is being pushed where and for what causes. Like, we talked a little bit about Zionism, and you look at the images that went back and forth on TikTok, to the point where literally Larry Ellison is basically being gifted it just to keep up that propaganda agenda. But what I'm saying is, there are these communities that gather, and it's honestly, it's like the world is becoming a giant high school, and it's almost as dysfunctional as that, because you have these little cliques and these clans that exist more across borders than between them. But what it also means is that if you're trying to pull a screw job in one place, you can't do it anymore the way you used to. Like, think back 20 years ago to the war on terror and embedded journalists, and what sort of narrative control that meant they have. That world is gone. And a lot of the propagandists who were really successful in that world are floundering terribly, which is why there's no confidence in anything. It's not just that they're doing terrible things, it's that they've stopped giving a coherent narrative for why.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'm old enough to remember watching Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News. And I remember, I'm not old enough to remember Lyndon Johnson's statement, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost middle America. I was just out of diapers at that point. But I mean, we used to have a certain belief, okay, if it's in the New York Times, it's probably true. And it's like, yeah, maybe that was a misguided belief, but there's no center of belief. There's no place where everybody gets their information from. There's not even like a half dozen places everybody gets their information from. What is Fox News? I want to say, like, the average Fox News viewer, I believe they're like as old as I am, 60 or a little older.
Well, sure. I mean, you're talking about different media, right? Like, literally, are you getting your news primarily through TV? Are you primarily getting your news through broadband? And I think, honestly, the gap could be pretty neatly mapped onto that, which really is sort of terrifying if you think about it for people like us, because the people who are getting propaganda news from Sean Hannity every night at 9 p.m. are not who is being worried about. It's the people who are here in the independent ecosphere of ideas. And I'll be honest, I don't have faith in any of the major actors. I mean, Elon Musk hasn't hired anyone that hasn't been signed off on by the freaking ADL. So I have no faith there, and it only goes downhill if you look at other areas. So it's definitely a concern of mine. It's something that I think, though, is going to lead to new and interesting odd ways of technology, because it seems like the marginal cost for connecting with people should be quite low. And then you have the whole AI aspect of it as well, how that's going to play into it. But I do certainly think that the big problem they have is that they do not have coherent explanations for things. I mean, if we want to pick an example because it's relevant, take Venezuela. We are
Yeah,
not in Venezuela because of the drug trade. That is not the truth. I am not
we're
sure
in
what it is.
Venezuela because Venezuela has a lot of oil, and because, and I think geopolitically, this isn't an entirely stupid strategy, which is always a step up from what we usually get from our politicians today. Rethinking America as, we are the ruler, we're the big cheese of the Western Hemisphere.
I mean, I'm a big fan of Monroe Doctrine Plus, and I actually don't have a problem with us picking on Denmark and Greenland and maybe even trying to break up Canada. I've said that on this show before. And if the argument was that they're sitting off the coast of Venezuela to manage the oil, that'd be good. Although I've read plenty of stories that Maduro basically offered day one to give up the oil. So I don't know what I believe there. To keep an eye on Panama, on the canal, and to have the Navy ready to move fast. I mean, let's not forget China's done what, 8 exercises this season alone around Taiwan. So that obviously has to be in the thinking of why they are where they are. But I think that, we can look at that and we can look at the oil and we can look at the geopolitics. And the American population at this point has lived close enough to the seat of the empire that they should just say something closer to what they're saying, what they're really doing. If we're going to go and do Manifest Destiny 2.0, this time we go north-south, fine. You know what? That actually that would be 1,000 times better than our entanglements in the Middle East. But I tell you what has me all messed up. I watched Netanyahu get up there and he started talking about how there were anti-Semitic behaviors in Venezuela that were related to Iran. And I'm like, is there something going on here that I don't know about? Because there is a real green red axis that exists between, at least it used to, between the paramilitary groups who were operating in the Middle East and who were operating in the jungles of Latin America. So, not that I'm trying to give too much credit, but I'm like, our interest seems directly linked into Israel's interest in Venezuela, which is almost, maybe it's peripheral for them. I mean, obviously it would be, but it's almost like they're signing off on it. And it's
Well,
this site you keep having again and again that's driving everyone insane.
yeah, well, I think one of the things to consider with Venezuela is I am assuming if we go to war with Venezuela, both China and Russia are going to provide them with weaponry. I expect that 100%. The Russians owe us one for Ukraine. Here's the whole thing with the weaponry. They don't have to start shooting it at American military vessels. They just have to start shooting it at ships going through the Panama Canal.
I'll tell you something that will surprise you. I don't think China wants a war with the U.S. I don't think Russia wants a war with the U.S. either. I think the Europeans are digging themselves into that hole. But I actually think there's a world that exists where China gets a slow ride up on Taiwan, Russia gets as much of Ukraine as they can swallow, and we get a free hand in the Western Hemisphere. That's actually a pretty good outcome in terms of realist politics. And
Realistically, that's what we should have done, right after Trump came to office.
we
I mean,
had the conversation then, but I don't know how far we are from that. I mean, I don't get the impression that Trump and Putin have a bad relationship, and I don't think Russia has the resources to expend getting itself in proxy wars in South America. I mean, let's be very honest. There's a live, active war happening for control of the Sahel of West Africa, where the Russians have pretty consistently been beating the French out of that whole region. So they're pretty heavily involved there, and maybe that's why Trump was doing some bombing in Nigeria. I don't know. I don't trust the cover stories on this. But the point is, Russia's force projection ability is limited. They don't want to get there. China's more interesting. They had that show on their TV where they were showing what a red team, blue team scenario of a Caribbean War, battle might look like. But on the other hand, I mean, China's going to need somewhere to sell their goods. They don't have a population that's continuing to rise. And honestly, a major war doesn't really seem like it's too beneficial to them because Russia's, even if they're very friendly with Russia right now, that relationship's always going to have problems because of the asymmetry of China's population and Russia's land. And then India is a third variable that sits there that, really is just serving its own interest. But China can't get too weak with that either. So, what I'm saying is, I guess, that the smart play that should happen is the big powers should sit at the table, figure out how they can keep peace between them, divide up the world in a perfectly Orwellian way, and get to the business of figuring out how to use technology to control their own serfs, like they seem to be doing.
Yeah, that would be a sensible thing to do. I mean, unfortunately, sensible things rarely seem to get done nowadays.
Yeah, I wonder that. I mean, it doesn't seem like the rest of the world is nearly as insane as the West is. I mean, it seems like Asia has more countries that are run reasonably than not. At least a lot more than it used to, by any reckoning. Latin America is more stable than it's been in a while, leaving aside Venezuela. I mean, Central America had been a mess forever. I mean, honestly, the country probably in most danger now of breaking is frigging Canada. But that's a whole nother story. I don't. I'm
But
not going to.
yeah, Canada, Canada is swirling around the economic toilet bowl.
Well, the problem
That's
they're ending up with is that they're basically importing full nations of people with such numbers and such speed that certain areas are they're not becoming ghettos, they're becoming enclaves. I mean, the thing about immigration, whether you're for it or against it, if your immigration pipe is substantially larger than your naturalization from your own citizens, the birthright, you're going to be in a pretty bad spot. And I think that's happening throughout Canada. And Alberta's going to be voting on separation here. They got the language, they got to go do one more hurdle they have to get over, but they're going to jump it. And with Carney being in there, I think they might leave. But which would not be bad for the United States, actually. But the point isn't even to get into that. I think the problem is this: writ large, technology is advancing faster than people's ability to keep up with it. Elites have realized that the carrying capacity of this world is they want it to be less so that they can manage it because they don't want prosperity if it means giving up authority. And that we are seeing this battle not fought as a coordinated campaign, but by a series of nepotistic battles, country to country, nation to nation, corporation to corporation, ideology to ideology, where everyone's thinking, how am I going to make sure I can hold on to a chair enough to survive until we come to the other side of this? And because the uncertainty continues to rise because of all sorts of reasons, the breakdown of the whole Bretton Woods system, the debt issues, potential for war, potential for asymmetric war, you know what? We could build a drone army, a drone navy for a fraction of what military spending has been before. That has to be the most destabilizing thing in a very long time. Although maybe it balances out because if everyone can have their own little personal guard drone, I don't know. But we are at a point where the formulas are so in flux that people are acting rashly, but they're acting rashly, much like the United States is, in a defensive way where they're projecting strength because their position is not fundamentally strong.
yeah, I mean, I think the problem is a lot of us, the position's not fundamentally strong. I mean, it's
I think you're right. I
that's
think we're all.
I mean, that's the problem is, our other problem I see with the drones is America once, I mean, it happened well before this, but after 91, after the fall of the Soviet Union, during that brief period where America could fancy itself the sole superpower, most of our arms and military procurement focused on shoveling wheelbarrows of money from the public coffers into the coffers of weapons manufacturers. We're not really set up to build a bunch of inexpensive drones we could swarm the hell out of people with because there's not enough of a profit margin on that for the Raytheons of the world.
But
You know,
maybe there could be, you know.
I mean, there
One of
could
the, one of
be.
the, one of the things that's interesting is that there's a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, I've seen a number of analyses, I'm terrible with names, of people in Russia who have said that Russia does not want to finish the war with Ukraine because it is building a Russian's arms industry. Because you have constant consumption, which is what you need for production in a surplus economy, right? And that's why you always end up with war command economies. So the question is, they're going slow. They didn't run over Ukraine as much as they could have because they were keeping their casualties light. Their own side developed drone warfare. But the Ukrainians have actually put up a more stout defense than they did previously because it is a disruptive sort of technology. And so we come down to questions of warfare. We're talking about mobility and speed, which drones give you, but we're also talking about quality. And so maybe a different way of thinking about quality is some people are looking at a Palantir type Anduril AI swarm model, but I'll tell you what the West has: a bunch of fat kids who play video games well. Could you imagine, just think in your mind's eye, 10,000 NEETs who are getting paid by the government to go out there and to be a battalion that were in the field in a game scenario? Think like Ender Wiggin in Ender's Game, or maybe even let them know where if you make real life a first person shooter, I don't think a lot of people would say no to it. I think you could put a surprisingly stout, human run, easily replaceable military in the field. And I am frightful for the fact that, I think the intention to do that is coming. I mean, honestly, if you look at how they've been treating the people in Gaza, those technologies between there and the battlefields of Ukraine have had enough field testing where it's just a question of how you set up the structure, the incentives. But you ask the question how you put the defense industry into it. Easy. You say we need trained operators. We'll pay 200,000, or we'll do debt forgiveness. Put a little bit of cherry on top of it. Let them take their 25-30% off the top. Charge for the rigs and send them out. You could literally fight that way. And given that we literally have our Congress talking about issuing letters of marque to go after Venezuelans, I mean, if we're going to be a pirate republic, then let's just own it.
Yeah, I don't think that's really going to be a good idea, because if you start playing with the letters of marque and reprisal, the cartels of Latin and South America are well funded. They have access to their own. What happens when, the cartels start responding by taking out American ships?
Well, I mean, this is the whole thing, right? We've reached the point where the state has surrendered sovereignty and no longer has the monopoly on it. Sometimes it's cartels, sometimes it's corporations. But ultimately, now we're having what might end up being a very dangerous pissing contest for the United States. Because the worst thing for Donald Trump to come out of here with is a whole scene of the emperor having no clothes. And there's a real chance that could happen down there.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we don't even really have to, you know, get hundreds of thousands of casualties. My guess, I've noticed with Americans, is once the casualty toll hits about 10,000, they start getting a little bit edgy. When it hits 50,000, you got people rioting in the streets. We
Which,
don't have the stomach for the kind of casualties it would take for a for a full scale war in Venezuela. We're going to do regime change. We're going to set up a bulkhead. We're talking about doing it in Iran. That's it. That's a non-starter.
yeah, empires have died on the step. I agree with that. We'll leave that one alone.
Yeah.
But when it comes to Venezuela, I mean, I think there's probably enough people who would be willing to do it. I mean, I think ICE could develop pretty easily into a paramilitary, and I think they've given it enough money to do that. But this comes back to the idea I shared with you earlier, which is why they very well might do my human drone idea, only because it gives people something to do. And there's a lot to be said for that, because if someone's fed and someone's occupied and they have a contest between them, I mean, honestly, the social benefits of it from their perspective probably would be quite high. I mean, because then you take the young, angry men out of the equation and you've basically turned a detriment to an asset. And I know this is incredibly cold thinking I'm talking about, but if you read what the bankers talk about, what they sit with each other, which is what I suggested earlier, they aren't worried about policies. They're worried about the programming that leads to the behavior that then justifies the policies as a rubber stamp down the line. Because if you don't do it that way, you have conflict. And the one thing you don't want to have if you're setting things up is you don't want conflict, because then you can't continue the technological trail of dribbling things out that allows for great wealth, like the way cures always come out, or excuse me, treatments come out of the medical system, but no cures. And it's deliberate. I mean, and I'm just saying it's simple, and it's not some grand conspiracy. You don't have to have people sitting in a dark room. Everyone's optimizing how to make money in a world. So we started by talking about Christianity, where the church, all of the churches, have made peace with usury. We have an idol. We want to have stuff. We want it now, and we will do whatever we need to do to get there. We do it individually. We do it collectively. We do it corporately. It's not a big surprise. And what's the least surprising thing of all is when technology finally gets close to maybe offering us some glimpses of a world that could be like that, the crisis starts because nobody knows who would be in control, and that's what they really care about. That's my take.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're seeing a shift in power. We're seeing, yeah, we're at one of those stages, like right after World War One, when okay, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is gone, the Russian Empire is gone, the British Empire is on its last leg. We're at a nexus point here. Basically the American empire is going downhill, the West is going downhill. All the other countries have their problems. I mean, I also think right and left used to be useful terms to kind of sort of describe people's political standards. You know, they're no longer that no longer works. We have a very divided country, but it's not divided on the same issues. I guess it'd be the way I would put it. I mean, I remember when being a left winger, being a populist, back when I was to be distrustful of big government and big corporations.
Well,
Today, it's kind of more about like, well, I just created this new gender and I have to fight for the rights of like people who believe that they're really dragons.
well, I don't want to go against the dragon folk. They're scary,
Yeah.
and they breathe fire. Got to watch for that. But
Yeah.
you're right about the politics. There are not two parties anymore. Those are just moving mechanisms, and honestly, they've kind of been like that since the new center movement of the Clintonistas. If we're really going to be honest, this has been 30 years in the making of putting pragmatic policy that benefits the oligarchy overhead. I mean, I come from a right wing perspective in theory, but in practice, it's not hard to see that at every opportunity, left wing populists took the payoff and left the policy behind. But I think it's even worse nowadays because I think identity is so modular and shifting across issues. It's like we've been through a couple crises now. We've been through some bad election campaigns. We've been through COVID. If you're a little bit older, 9/11 debt crisis. And you're starting to realize that people shift sides way too often to work together. So the advantage of this in terms of social programming is it's very, very hard to organize anything against the state or against the existing system because your allies are going to backstab you as soon as the dance changes. That's inevitable. I've lived it. The other problem, though, is if you ever need your own people to back you up for something, and this is the United States' real big problem, there's a lot of people who would fight in the United States. There's not that many who would fight for the United States. And the ones most likely to do it are the ones doing it, honestly, for the most materialistic reasons. This, too, is just like late Rome, where eventually the mercenaries realized what did they need the empire for?
Yeah, we're the kingmakers. How about we just like skip the middleman and just go to being kings?
And I think that's pretty close to where we are in the story. I mean, I would argue that, if you're an Elon Musk type figure, if you're Jeff Bezos, you functionally have more power. If you're Miriam Adelson, I mean, if you're Larry Fink, Larry Ellison, there are these players at this level. But I do think the United States will probably have a seat at the table, if only because even if we have an inefficient military. We have a very large one, and the way interests overlap, America will be saved if it is by the one thing that it still has two oceans separating it. And really, it is not the core interest of the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, or anyone else to be involved over on these continents. It just doesn't make sense. So I know there's been talks about something that they've been thinking to put together in certain meetings, think tank groups, to replace the UN Security Council. They call it the C5. And supposedly it will have the US, Russia, India, China, and Japan is rumored to be the fifth country for balance and for the fact that, frankly, the Asians kind of trust one another for competency more than they want to get into the sectarian conflicts that are more common in the Middle Eastern region. So I don't know if that's going to pay off yet, but I do think that you see a massive change. And, if we were seeing a little bit more production at home, I would say that whatever else he's doing, Trump might be wisely investing in domestic production. And I do see money coming in for that purpose. It's just very hard to assess what's happening in terms of building up America because of the fact that the politics here do not serve the interests of the people who live here. And for at least you and I and some portion of this audience, that's not an abstract problem.
Yeah, no, it's the problem with rebuilding the American infrastructure. Our manufacturing base has been hollowed and gutted. It would take more than 4 years to rebuild it. It would take more than 8 years to rebuild it. Pretty much any plan you come up with is going to change within that time. You can't have a 10-year plan with 4-year presidential elections.
I agree. I mean, that's what's really interesting. Trump's trying to put out this Golden Fleet battleship idea. I don't know if you saw this, but some of the military channels were taking a look at it. He wants to put out 10 new battleships. They're more like drone destroyers, I think is a more accurate description of what they're looking at. But they want to rebuild shipbuilding capacity. But the problem is, how do you do that not just with the problems you discussed, which are totally valid, but also the loss of institutional experience? You have lost generations of talent that were across families, and whatever you didn't lose from military cuts, you also lost through DEI, where, frankly, affirmative action type policies that rewarded compliance to rules have made a mess of the military since, I'd argue, if you remember the tailhook scandal back in the early 90s.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, you've got the problem. The one that really frightens me is we've essentially lost our family farms. There are really very few small farmers left. You have a lot of our farming is mostly large agri-industrial corporations that rely on industrial agriculture. When gas becomes too expensive to run that industrial agriculture, when we can no longer support that, we don't have a base of people who know how to farm, basically using using manure and, those techniques on 30 to 50 acres.
No, and that's not the plan. I mean, what they want is technology agriculture, which is why they pushed out small farmers. And I mean, it goes back to NAFTA again, right? Because between the corn subsidies that were the third rail of American politics and NAFTA that dumped, all that corn on Mexico, that was what started the first Great Migration post Hart-Celler into the United States. It was those dumping policies. You can look at it. The numbers jump from about 500,000 a year up to well over 1 million. And it's because you destroyed lower Mexico and Guatemala's corn crop by having chemically Monsanto run type corn dumped in numbers by huge corporations that displaced family farms because the government set up 4 different insurance policies and made a monoculture of the Midwest. So now you get GMO corn everywhere, and you started moving the people. And these are the sort of polycrises that happen where it doesn't really matter if you look at people making short term decisions that are just designed for their own financial benefit, or if you look at it longer term, that how it always ends up being that the money ends up being costed in the end because you've destroyed where you're actually existing. You end up with these sort of locust type ideologies of how capital functions. That frankly, I mean, I guess it's really not that different. I mean, this is the same stuff Mitt Romney got wealthy on, and they put him up for president 14 years ago, whatever it was. We have this, the philosophies don't change, just the trappings of them.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, but the thing is when the agricultural stuff collapses, when we can no longer support it, small farming is not something where you can go read a couple books and pick it up and take it up. It's stuff people learned through generations.
Small farming is not designed to sustain commercial level operations. You would have to have a whole new model of food distribution if you wanted to have that, where you'd have diversified crops coming from local areas. Now, I'll tell you what could make that happen: hyperinflation and poverty. Those two things. I saw it when I was in Argentina. Everyone always grows things on their own because they don't know when the money won't work. And we might be on a pathway that leads that way, where then you're going to see stuff like this tax revolt people are talking about it. I think anything's going to come of it, but they're talking about it because they're getting to the point where no one is getting the incentives. The old folks can't sell their houses because no one can afford them. The young folks can't afford their jobs because no one's buying anything. The people in the middle can't get out of any situation because the interest situation. So everyone is stuck in a constant decline. And at some point, you're going to see people start to jump out of those escalators. But when they do, if the dollar doesn't hold up, and you were talking about China holding back silver, we could look at other countries, other resources. If the US dollar really goes into a complete nosedive, which is a non zero possibility, then you might actually see localized agriculture develop as a stress test thing, in the same way that people who lived through the Depression always did certain things certain ways. I mean, we've been through enough at this point, trauma wise, between COVID, between shutdowns, that I think there is a great desire amongst young people to do things hands on. It's just that there is a total lack of resources. And in some cases, to be fair, a real lack of agency. But in other cases, not. There are many people who are young who are working like crazy, and they're just getting a raw deal. And at some point, all finance relies on leverage, right? So, what are you going to leverage on someone who has nothing when you have nothing they want? I mean, how much do you think you can roll through just fear alone? Because I think that's where they're heading. I mean, honestly, why else are we seeing the rehabilitation of none other than Mark Levin?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, Mark Levin, like, let me guess, also loud Zionist?
No, you kidding?
No.
He was all
Oh,
rocking
sorry.
the Free Palestine colors. You know that.
Oh, I don't know Mark Levin. I don't know.
Yeah, he's for everybody, you anti Semite. Shut up. Mark
Oh,
Levin's great. And who are you and who do you know? And or have you been in the state of Florida recently? Because we don't tolerate down there. But no, I
uh,
mean they seem to think they can silence everyone, and who knows, maybe they'll try. But I tell you what, I mean, for people under 40, this problem, this us versus them, is becoming clearer each day because the consolidation of the media is happening in real time.
yeah, and they no longer have the resource. Like, okay, in the you'll notice the worst of the Vietnam protests started, like, in the 70s, just as the great, that post-war prosperity started hitting, you started getting sand in its gears. You started seeing the recession. You started seeing they could no longer keep the kids entertained with, well, just go to college, you'll have a job, you'll be like us, we got a house, we got a vacation house, you're certainly going to go further than we were. And we have a bunch of kids that are growing up in a declining economy, and we don't really have anything to keep them distracted when we're trying to hold a policy that's as unpopular already as Vietnam was.
It's
I mean,
absolutely true. I mean, the thing that's different now, I think a lot of the underlying factors are very similar. What is different though is people's ability to organize. People can share ideas very quickly and images very quickly. Then again, people cannot organize in person for anything, especially when the Fed to person ratio, any event is automatically enormous. But yeah, I mean, and what happened? You pick those times. So let's take from Jack Kennedy's death through Watergate's ending. What did they ram through? They rammed through the gold standard. They rammed through the things with China. They rammed through the Civil Rights Act. They rammed through Hart-Celler. And I'm not trying to be difficult, but they rammed through the expansion of the Vietnam War. So what they basically agreed to do was increase the size of the state, increase the amount of the wars, increase the strength of the corporations. And that's what they did, and they were very effective at that. And it impoverished the country, and especially with the hyperinflation, you look at the costs. I was used to joke, watch old game shows from 1960s and then compared to 1980, and watch how the same car jump 10x in price. That was not the cars getting that much better. That was the dollar getting that much weaker. And at this point, how much more can we take? I mean, it's getting to the point where the fast food industry now is getting hollowed out. You're going to have an economy with no employers because there's no purchasing power out there. And then I don't know what
I
happens.
mean, we've got the problem that, yeah, I've seen over the past 2 years, I've seen grocery prices, close to doubling. That's in a couple of years. Home prices, I want to say, I think you could buy a home and get a 15-year mortgage on a home in the 50s or 60s for what was about 2 to 3 times the annual salary.
Yeah, absolutely. And they utterly refuse to drop the interest rates. I mean, Trump's been hinting that he's going to put a new Fed chair in there, but honestly, people cannot get into new homes. And you talk about the cost of living. I agree with you on the food prices. I do the shopping in my family for that. It's absolutely true. And let's talk about energy prices. A lot of people have seen them almost 2x there. And the other thing in that is everyone wants to expand. They put in these AI data centers. They are total energy hogs. It's like having a crypto mine in your bedroom. What happens is a limited resource becomes more expensive, and the people being priced out of the market are the people who have to live there, and they're getting livid about it. This is a major issue
I
in
think they're running into a problem with AI that it's no longer, if we double the size, if we double the power draw, we'll get double the results, or even we'll get like, if we up it 100%, we'll get 80% better results. It's now getting more like if we up it 100%, we might get 10 to 20% better results. That's not real. I think we're hitting the limits. We're going to run into trouble with China for this because AI in the West seems to be all about, well, throw more power at it, not like how do we use this power more efficiently so we can understand, so we can get more with the same amount of computing power and the same amount of electricity. A friend of mine who works in AI said the reason the West doesn't do that is they don't really want affordable AI that like any company that can put together like a network of 30 or 40 computers can have like an AI center. They want an AI that requires big money and big electricity. And the problem is, we're kind of maxing out on our power grid.
100% true, and I think that's behind what's behind the rush to start putting in all these nuclear plants again. You see people talking about China just had a breakthrough actually in sustaining cold fusion quite a bit longer, and I think that what's happening actually is I think science through implementing certain advantages of using AI. AI used properly basically allows you to vector various things to hone in on what would make sense to solve a problem. But what we don't see, and what you're 100% right about, is the use of smarter architecture as opposed to more power. There was a paper that just came out this week. The team who had been working with DeepSeek put it out there, and they changed something in the infrastructure where they entered a second parallel component to reconsider the filters. Yeah. Basically, the way LLMs work, for those who don't understand, think kind of how you might have filtered for gold with a pan by shaking it back and forth until it fell into a certain slot. It's not that dissimilar to that mathematically. I mean, there's tons of stuff you could watch on it because I have some involvement in the field as well. But what you would find in that case is they took something where the randomness risk was 3000x, and now it's down to 1.6x. So they, through a simple architecture change, have potentially, the first estimates are, improved the ability to analyze data 300-fold at a fraction of the cost. And this was the same model that spooked all Wall Street last year. I'm sure NVIDIA is having a terrible day because of this, actually. But these are the sort of things that we are not doing because we are not innovating, because we have disempowered our sort of geek class. You know what I mean? Like, I remember when the internet was coming up, it was guys who could literally work and code on their own. And AI is going to permit people to do that again. It permitted me to help translate the Bible. So I can see why it would be good in certain ways. But the problem is, it's all leading into a sort of boutique economy that's completely incompatible with the whole way the economy is structured and the way the political and financial classes think about their own involvement. So we have more variables than controls. The miracle is that this rickety old car has kept them on the tracks as long as it has.
I mean, I'm expecting the AI crash. I was in New York City during the Web 1.0 boom in 2000, in 99 through 2001. I remember, you know, you could get people throwing money at you. You could, if you had a website, and a lot of people threw a lot of money around, and then a lot of people lost their money when they discovered, okay, there's really, these are not profitable ideas. I mean, the classic one is pets.com, that had a really cool mascot, but in their fact, when they factored in how they were going to ship their dog food, they hadn't really thought about the fact that shipping 50 pounds of dog food is expensive. That's, you
You're
have,
right. I mean, they do work
you,
it out. I mean, Stewie must have somehow worked it out. I don't know. I don't know how
okay,
her
a
model.
few people worked it out, but a lot of people got shaken out.
No,
That's what I
I think
expect to see with AI.
so. So
I
here's
mean,
what I
AI
think.
is here to stay, I think.
No, let's split the difference, right? Because I know you're more of an AI pessimist, and oddly enough, I'm an AI optimist. But here's what's going to happen: AI is going to cost a ton of people their jobs, waste a whole lot of electricity, and service a lot of things that we don't already like more cheaply in ways that are more annoying to us. And that therefore, for most people, it may very well end up being a nuisance. And for most firms that people are investing in small startups, nothing is going to happen. 90% of businesses always fail. This will be no different. There will be a couple big actors that succeed, probably because they'll get funding from the state, who has access to technologies in this area we probably do not. So I can agree with all that. But even if you use a consumer grade AI like a chat GPT, what it really is, in my mind, it allows you to amplify the way you want to use your mind. If you want to use it to get smarter and challenge yourself and use it to augment what your capacities are, it can work. However, if your goal in life is to find the path of least resistance, I think what AI probably will lead to, more commonly than not, is regression to the mean for individuals. And that is more disturbing because we're already at a point where, you know, we have generations that in a lot of ways aren't going to have the communicative abilities that are required because they've lived in a world that doesn't just not allow for those practices, but actually discourages them at many cases as a social faux pas because for whatever reason, and there's a lot of them, we could get into it, the younger generations just do not connect in a way that generations previously have. I'll give you an example. You look at liquor consumption, just one example. Why? Because they don't socialize the same way.
Liquor
Why? Because their
consumption,
economics.
marijuana consumption,
Sure.
casual sex.
Well, but I'm saying no, liquor
Yeah,
consumption's down though. That's the
that's
weird
what
thing.
I'm saying. It's
Yeah.
all those things are like, we used to be, okay, I came up I'm right between I'm at the end of the baby boom and the beginning of Gen X. I'm the first year Gen X or 65. I mean, we grew up like, you were expected to be kind of dissolute and experiment with drugs if you were like, a teenager. We
And I'm 45 years old, just to put the bookend it. I'm literally 1980, so I'm like Xer, millennial split right on the edge of that generational gap. And like we were the last ones who remember living in an analog world. Like I can even deal with my younger brother who's just 5 years younger than me and he just does not connect the same way. Something fundamentally changed at the point where computers were ubiquitous, screens were everywhere, and all of those sorts of questions. And it leads to these uh, our social networking is much more we occupy places in a lattice than that we are really organic actors. And like we might light up the lattice differently, but people fundamentally, I think, are staying way closer to home, whatever that means to them. And that's become the American dream. I mean, the American dream used to be expansive. Now it's just to know that the roof over my head isn't going to be lost because the rent went up again and I can't afford it when I lost my second job.
Yeah, well, that's what's happening. One I find interesting with a one interesting use for me of AI is the way it's been used to run bots and to produce clickbait glurge. If you have you been on Facebook lately? Have you noticed you'll see these just like like go through your feed, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of pages of what is clearly AI generated sentimental crap. And
Yeah.
boomers love this stuff.
Well, Hallmark cards were always popular, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
but you used to have to hire a Hallmark card writer. I mean,
well,
yeah, you
that's the
saw
whole thing.
lots of, yeah.
It's
Now,
like, well, you and I both know the gig economy. I'll tell you a good example of this. Take the company Fiverr. Fiverr was very successful for quite a while, and it was basically a collection of freelance artists and trainers and various people who had skill sets who were taking short term and sometimes longer gigs, but short term and commission type gigs. And now there's no work. I have another friend who's an artist who tells me the same thing. There's nothing in it. Music's going to be next. I mean, how
I
many
did
people?
that Upwork. I was on Upwork for years. I made a decent living on Upwork for several years. Things are starting to pick up again,
Good.
but they're not like I went through a real slow period. And one of the things is what I do is content writing. And people fit you have a lot of people that are like, why am I going to hire somebody to do content? I can just put a couple prompts into Chat GPT and I can get all the content I need. And it's like it's not that simple.
No,
I
and
mean,
a lot of people
this.
don't
We've
use.
worked with prompts. It's not a simple matter of, hey, AI, give me material for my website. You have to know how to ask the questions. You have to know what you're looking for. And you have to know how to fix it. And you don't really, so the problem is people don't find that out until they've watched their watch their SEO rankings tank because SEO can get or their conversions because SEO you know AI generated SEO can do reasonably well because the Google algorithm is AI.
Yeah, just so people know, search engine optimization is what he's saying.
Yeah. Search engine optimization. And it's like you can create great SEO, but you don't really AI cannot, without a lot of hand holding, produce content that generates clicks. It generates clicks that generates retention.
It's hard for me to relate to this just because my experience with SEO is I run up against hard algorithmic blocks because of the topics I like to talk about.
Yeah, I get that, man. Like, yeah, it's like, use your SEO optimization will work great, until you start talking about, certain subjects or certain topics will like get you in a little bit of trouble. We all know what I mean. Not saying, not pointing the finger at any direction, but, I've definitely noticed that like stuff will get blocked off for like bad politics. That's still going on. That's another use of AI that you get, using
Which,
AI
by the
to
way,
find
is a
people.
fast-growing one. You need to be aware of that. The filtrations are getting harder and deeper about that because, and it's going to be a big problem too, because it's going to make the model not work effectively because you're denying the basic logic that makes an LLM effective. But I mean, that's where we are in this story, though. And if there's a point for hope, I mean, Lord knows hope isn't really what I deal in usually, but this is the hope. The hope is that now the war really has shifted to who can push a narrative better and faster. And we have people who are not very good at it because they're selling lies in a particularly ineffectual way. And, I see so many people returning to traditional thinking, traditional practices. You see people going into the Orthodox faith. You see people going into the Catholic faith. You see people going back to the old ways wherever they live. And it's really this disbelief in the world but it's also this idea that maybe there's a different narrative. And if we're going to fight these battles, if we're going to talk about them, politics is pointless because you win an election and then they do the opposite because the donors make the decisions because they bet reasonably that you're not going to hold them to consequence. So, all right, so you start holding them to consequence. Let's say you vote out everyone who's in power, just vote them all out. Anyone who took $1 from APAC. I bet you could get enough people on the side to make probably 300 people of Congress lose their office by doing things like that. And that's where the level has to be fought. Narrative type battles where we say this is acceptable, this isn't acceptable. Broadband coalitions across sides where we recognize that the state and the politicians are the enemy because they service a narrow interest rather than a broad one. And I don't think the broad interest even exists to be put back together. And to pretend it is going to be is only an invitation to deceit. So, fine. We now live in an era of mass information. It needs to be mass democracy in the sense that we just keep kicking people out as fast and as hard as we can every time they lie. And they're going to keep lying. Of course, they're going to keep lying, and we may not survive the process. But it's probably the best thing we can do this side of, if they decide to really go after the First Amendment and pass some draconian hate speech law. If they try to do a Janet Reno type action like that, I think people will have to treat that with the seriousness that Mr. Patrick Henry might have for the same reasons.
I think one thing that I have noticed over the past over really the past year or two, I've seen this really come out is we've become polarized to a point like I donated money to a friend of mine who was running as a Democrat and who used Act Blue for it, and now I get all kinds of mail from Act Blue, and one of them was, you know, they were saying out loud, not even trying to hide it. Well, the Republicans are gerrymandering all over the place, so we have to gerrymander too to make sure that we stay in power. I mean, 10 years ago, oh, people did gerrymandering, but you put a nice face on it. You would have said, you wouldn't come out and say, well, we have to make sure that the Republicans in our state can't vote.
It's
You
one of the
wouldn't have
interesting things,
said,
though, is how many people on the left would say the Democrats don't represent them, and how many people on the right, of course, would say the same of the Republican. So it's almost like they're making the blood sport more violent to try to keep the audience when so many people have left because the core product isn't good anymore,
and if you have a bunch of disaffected people and you have a general attitude across the place that my political opponents, or for a lot of people, the whole system is corrupt and evil, and we need to, if like we need to do something about it, sooner or later that devolves into shooting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we I mean, what's really frightful about our scenario we're in right now, if we're honest about it, is it's kind of like 10% with all the assets on one side and 90% who don't really get along well, but that are kind of stuck with one another in facing this contest on the other side. And the people who are in that 10% group are going to play left hand versus right hand. And it's really hard not to play that way because honestly, when you're not getting what you want politically, you don't become more moderate about your views. You're like, if I'm not going to get it, I'm going to be the most hard ass person I can be, only because that's the only benefit. I mean, you and I have both spent our time on the fringes of politics. We know the mentality, we understand the mentality. But I do hope that something emerges to change it. I mean, maybe something in technology, maybe something that can change the dynamics of abundance because uh, realistically from any other perspective, just looking at the internal logic of the economics and the politics involved, there's not a lot of cause for hope in the near to midterm future, short of some sort of miraculous intervention of various kinds that are fun to think about. And there's things you could see if you want to see, but it's going to be something that comes from totally outside of the people we've actually put in positions to be in any way responsible from our societies.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I expect for probably for the next generation or two, we're going to see ongoing economic contraction. I mean, America is going to be poorer. If we get the Soviet Union style collapse of the American government, which honestly would be an optimistic scenario. If we get that, we're dealing with, I would say over the next 10 to 20 years after the American empire finally goes swirling down the bowl, about a decline of 50% in the standard of living. That would put us right between, I want to say, Paraguay and Slovenia. No, Costa Rica and Slovenia. I
I think that if America had the living standard of Paraguay, Costa Rica, or Slovenia, and you gave me the choice of any of those four countries, America would probably be last on my list for survivability because the cost isn't going to go down. This is like one of the weird things. It happens a lot in Latin America, but not just there. The Europeans are dealing with it. You think just because the standard of living goes down that the prices go down. The prices stay there, and you just don't have access to those things. And that is the really both disgusting, angering, and also humiliating, defeating parts of it that you see that it's almost paraded in front of you. And so it's just a question of what holds societies together at that point. In those other countries where you have basically heavily mono-ethnic populations, I mean, actually, Paraguay is one of the most tribally homogeneous nations in South America. Very strange, sad, long history worth reading. War of the Triple Alliance is the bloodiest war in Latin America when Paraguay decided to Zerg rush Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina all on its own. Didn't end well, but they were brave. And then, of course, you have the small countries like Slovenia, which, to the best of my knowledge, seems like a fairly pleasant country there, on the Adriatic coast.
Yeah, I mean it's a pleasant country. I think with America, I mean you can have a decline in the standard of living that and I mean it sounds counterintuitive, but and be happier than you were during the boom because like frankly, I think becoming the sole superpower was really genuinely bad for America and bad for the American people. we lost a lot of stuff. I'd like to see America reinvent itself as Canada South. Okay, yeah, we're a big country. We're proud of our country. We have no interest. Canada never had dreams of we're going to take over like the world. Once we
Well,
got
you know
those
what? When
dreams,
they did, they were still part of the British Empire. I mean,
yeah,
there was a time when there was a different thought, but basically, in 100 years, I agree with you that hasn't been the case. Um, but when the thing about the American Empire is at no point did the American people vote for it. In fact, at every opportunity they could vote, they voted against it. They voted at every opportunity for vote for the guy who either got us out of the war or would keep us out of the war, who then got us into the war and kept us in the war. But at every opportunity, they didn't want the National Security Act that made the permanent security state that Truman got in there. And then, depending on why you think Jack Kennedy is killed, a lot of people talking about Demona these days as part of the mix, that you had the desire to have a national security state. And, a lot of these things happened very quietly during the 40s and the 50s. After FDR got in there, we never went back to peacetime after World War II. And, a lot of things were said about the greatest generation, especially in light of what happened with the boomers afterwards. But let's take a more critical look at that. Those wars, what did they accomplish? The national security state, well, they were just sitting there nursing PTSD. What did that do? How were they as parents with how their own kids turned out? And to be honest with you, if you're willing to look at it that way, and people in Gen Z are because they haven't grown up with shibboleths of "Thou shalt not question World War II," and America is always right. Well, if you take a look at that, you fought a war where a bunch of people got killed to live in a world that was less good than you had before, where basically you became the linchpin of a global system your people hated, that has sucked the wealth and opportunity decade after decade from the Marshall Plan onto today.
yeah, we fought on the wrong side in World War II for the simple reason that there was no right side to fight for. Oh, the German fascists are going to kill the communists. Let's sit back and whoever wins, we're still better for it. They got rid of the communists. Oh, that's terrible. They got rid of the fascists. Oh, that's terrible. What did we create? We created a stronger Soviet Union that became our enemy. We trashed Europe and then got ourselves involved in NATO, where we were, we out we encouraged Europe to outsource their military to us, which
Now,
meant we were militarily involved in an area an ocean away. I mean, George Washington would have brought his riding crop out and flogged you for suggesting such a thing.
well, it's the old joke they used to say about NATO was the job was to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. And it really has been that way, but it's been that way for 100 years because America's alliance with the British Empire really has not served the American interest. I mean, if we're going to play a little bit of alternate history, the point of divergence that makes the most sense is if the United States does not enter the First World War, or alternatively, if the United States enters World War One on the German side. If that happens, the United States likely conquers Canada, regardless of whatever else happens in that situation. And you would have ended up with a much more equitable settlement where that war would have probably been solved earlier. And you might have avoided the terror that was the Bolshevist collapse of Russia, because you wouldn't have had America using communists as a neutral third party. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Every time you look at the communists, it really is the financial heavies on capitalism that are paying for them, because these links are more tribal than they are anything else in economics. And that is the reason why, no matter where you live, if you're these countries that are world powers, the financial forces that sort of operate underneath and around you always seem to fund the totalitarianisms that eventually displace you. And it's no different that with the United States, what we did with Kissinger and with the rise of China. I mean, China's rise was no accident, but the United States at every step of the way did everything we could to help facilitate that. And now we want to pretend they're our enemy. I mean, that's kind of a silly way to spend your time with your investment.
We were shocked, just shocked when, the golem we created turned on us.
Yeah. Well, you know
I,
what? You wonder who created and who's the golem. I mean, Miriam Adelson's casinos are doing pretty well on that East Chinese coast. Just saying.
yeah. Oh, I mean, I'm sure there were people who got have gotten very wealthy off this. I mean, we in America, like in America, the good news is if you're a working class person, you can afford like a 50-inch color TV 4K screen costs, you know, less. I mean, not even like not only less in 2025 dollars, less in like $1960 than like a 25-inch television cost.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the
But
cost
it's
differential
like
is
the cost of
crazy.
that stuff went down. The problem is the cost went down because like so much that Americans couldn't make the stuff anymore at cost.
No, no, of course not. Well, because our nation's been sold out by the fact that, and this is the telling part, right? The people who run these corporations, who are in the C suites, as they call them, the corporate suites, they think in terms of finance flows. They think in terms of jurisdictions, but their fundamental identity is not linked to any state. And it's not just Zionists and people who like to dance with dreidels who fit into that category. There are plenty of other people in that class, and it kind of makes me think that maybe the way we need to start thinking of things, because I think as sort of a once activist and reformer is to think beyond national identity. And to be honest, a poor schlep who lives in Nova Scotia probably has a lot more in common with a poor schlep who lives in Maine than they do with someone who is living in on the Upper East Side in Manhattan,
I
where all the money is.
mean, I think this is something class makes a much, Marx, much as it pains me to say this, Karl Marx got a few things right. One of the things was about the importance of class. I've I've found one of the problems that I've seen with a lot of the people who were on really loud on the mighty whitey scene is, I live in a working class neighborhood that's largely black and Latino. I grew up working class. I find I have more in common with my neighbors than I do with the people three towns up who like grew up in wealth,
Yeah.
even though, ethnically I'm closer to those people.
Well, and I think the interesting thing that's going to happen now is that I don't think class is going to work either as much of a container, mainly because of how people see themselves differently, and because there are these other divisions, including ethnic divisions, which are not small, especially when you're fighting over competing resources. But what I think actually is going to be the resolution of this, which I think your own work actually in a lot of ways that I've watched over the years has predicted it, is we're going to have religious nationhood at some point. And I think you're going to have a more universal sense of Christendom as it will become the institutional force that people lean on as the state leans into them. And that you're going to see Christendom against Judaism again. And, it'll be really interesting to see how the Muslims act as a third actor in that. You can see every effort being made to make every threat appear Muslim. Like they talk about Qatar, like Qatar somehow owns our government. Yeah, right. People realize that isn't the case, and it might end up being the world's biggest squeeze play, because as hard as it is, as much as it seems like it's been in disarray, and the churches institutionally are terrible, I think there's more opportunity for people to come into the faith than there has been in a great amount of time. And I think that when that force manifest, you're going to see figures like a Father, Coughlin type figures emerge and you might see something that really is outside of what we've been thinking for a long time, because the authority of the state has lapsed. So people are going to ask the logical question: where's the moral authority? I mean, they elected a guy who was once worked for Pinochet as the president down there in Chile. So you're seeing things move in, they say it's the Francoist direction, and we all know that's just a nice way of putting a little bit different veneer on things. But I think there is actually a demand and a desire to move back towards something more akin to a crusader culture amongst the lower classes. I mean, because you think about, hospitallers, you think of some of the mendicant orders over time, the Franciscans. These are the backbones of the churches that have lasted today. I mean, you and I both know our Catholic history pretty well. These are things that I think might be on the agenda for the days ahead. And when that happens, it's not the hardest thing to think of, that as government loses authority, practical authority may end up going to bishoprics again, because people are going to need a way to figure it out. And that will probably be, in a lot of places, especially rural places, but places throughout Europe as well, the least offensive suggestion. It's kind of how it worked out the first time,
Yeah.
and why the HRE looked like it did.
I mean, I think ultimately the idea we could have start having holy empires, or just more like, you will start seeing more people going to church as things get worse. I mean, what did the Soviet Union go from, like 7 to 10% of the people identifying as Orthodox to something like 75% of them now?
Yeah. Well,
And
I
I
mean,
mean,
the
it's
move
like,
is on. People are joining. They're leaving, denominations that make peace with the world, or that are with obvious evil actors, and they're going back to the traditional congregations. Now,
I
these are
mean,
global patterns.
it's I think even the evangelicals are starting to realize that, you know, in exchange for all of their, you know, like all of their shucking and jiving for Israel and the Third Temple, they're starting to realize that, well, but they still don't like us very much, do they? I mean, I can say on conservative Catholic standards, like, yeah, like Zion is like, you won't find a lot of Catholic Zionists,
Well, I think the
just to
one
put
thing is,
that
I think a lot
politely.
of the pastors institutionally like the financial support they get from Israel. I think a lot of the rank and file parishioners just have really terrible theology, and they think Israel is going to get itself blown up to get raptured out. But isn't that the American way, right? That you're going to believe blowing up people in some other country somehow saves you to be the paragon of whether it's a spiritual belief or an
Yeah,
ideology.
the Third Temple, you said it like we opened up the episode with this. That's the abomination of desolation. Why would you, as a Christian, want to support it to speed up, the apocalypse?
Hey, accelerationism says you got to get the Antichrist on the scene to get the big man back. That's what they think. I'm
I
just going
mean,
to blunt about it.
accelerate. That's like, yeah, I'm going to light a fire under God's feet. Well, what do I mean, that's what you're really saying. Well, God isn't working on my timeline, so let's speed it up by like helping the Israelis, bring the Antichrist.
There's a book called The Seven Mountain Mandate, which basically says that. And they are a lot of people who operate in Trump's sort of prayer circle. And I will say, just for clarity, as a scholar, I actually, I don't want to get into my denominations because I don't fit in any of these groups, but that historical Protestant congregations would have been aghast at all of this. In fact, they were. If you go back to the history of it, I know you've done your work on Schofield and Darby, and we don't need to go down that whole mess. But the point of it is, those churches, even the Southern Baptist Convention, which historically has been the largest church in America, shrinking, losing members. And the reason why is because they're not offering a holistic worldview that, makes sense, and that is fundamentally not collaborating with the world as much. I think to the extent churches stay away from the world, they're gaining popularity. And like I said, I think that's why you've seen the movements that have happened, including conservatism within Catholicism, becoming more muscular than it's been in some generations, I'd argue. Is actually a healthy outcry of this. But I do think that Christians will probably at some point look at their identity as being beyond and above their politics, which we were always instructed to do, but we haven't done in a very long time. And it didn't start with the state being higher; it was with the laws of nature, But we've now entered an era, and this is maybe the interesting part of the social media breakdown, where since there's no truth and everyone can believe what they want, what you're going to see is religious resumption of rights that were destroyed by the consensus of materialism. And I think it's going to be really fascinating. And I'll be blunt. I think we're going to enter an age of magic and miracles again, because we're going to allow the consciousness to consider possibilities that we were previously told were not possible. But none of that's biblical in any understanding of anyone who's read the Acts of the Apostles,
Yeah, no, none of, like, I mean, in some ways, like the church was like in some ways closer to God before it came to power. The problem is you can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't go back and say, hey, Constantine, why don't we just make Christian? Well, actually, no. Constantine didn't make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. He allowed people to worship as Christians without persecution. You could be with other people, can be around there. The Romans generally didn't like rioting. Because when you run an empire, you like things to be peaceful, because if things aren't peaceful, you have to go take care of them, and that means taking manpower away from the borders.
I think
But
that's part of it, but I think by that time Rome was looking for a creative force. Its civic religion had largely died out. The empire was moving to the Greek center, and Christianity was getting pretty lively over there. So, I mean, I think it was a little bit more pragmatic to that. But then again, you're talking to a guy who thinks, Clement of Alexandria did nothing wrong and thinks Origen should be a saint.
you and me both. I mean, Origen, people don't understand. I mean, Origen was one of the first writers on the Trinity. Origen Origen was schooled by the guy who trained Plotinus. They were in the same class. Supposedly, he thought Plotinus was his second smartest student.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I've kind of become a little bit of a Miaphysite. My pronunciations are terrible, but not that we need to reenact the civil wars of religion of the second century. Although it is interesting, because what it comes down to is Constantine made a political decision. And for the reason you described, precisely so, that he didn't want revolts and he wanted to have a little oomph for the late empire. So Christianity got the push, and it was able to do that. And it served as good glue, but the price of it serving as glue politically is a lot of the dynamism was lost, I would argue. And I would certainly say the first and second century do not resemble what pop up in later institutions in Catholicism, to a large extent, to Orthodoxy to a lesser extent, and to Protestantism at all. Because Protestantism is basically a heresy of Catholicism. And I'm not saying that to be mean, but I'm saying that
That
when you
is.
use Jerome,
I'm a
well, when you
Catholic.
use
I'll tell
Jerome,
you that. You
sola
know,
scriptura, it isn't, because Jerome itself is a bastardization of the Septuagint, and I had to learn Greek to know that. So, which is all fine. But the bottom line is, you don't know what happened because you weren't really there. So you got to go back as far as you can. Basic historiography. You look for the firsthand sources, and the firsthand sources. Christians were a communal, very Neoplatonic, supernatural believing group who were on the periphery of societies, who were trying to do something with
absolutely.
consciousness that got lost as law, because what basically happened is Midwich tried to read Paul and turned him into a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode. That's what happened.
I saw, you know, absolutely the first 300 years of Christianity, they lived in a Greek polytheist world. There were lots of sects that were competing with each other. Christianity was just one of them. There's a lot of ideas in Christianity, a lot of them that survived into Catholicism and Orthodoxy that come out of Greek paganism. And that's because the Greek pagans got a fair bit of stuff right. I mean, I think lots of people before the ideas of Christianity, I like to call myself a Tolkien Catholic. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis both felt that yes, you see certain themes reenact themselves in religions over and over again. That doesn't mean that they're all one religion, but it means like if you're looking for the truth, God is not going to hide from somebody who's looking for him.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think that, in reality, if you didn't have Plato, the Greeks wouldn't have become Christian. There were a lot of ideas in that vein that worked very well with what Christ was teaching, that did not work and were not going to work with Semitic cultures. I mean, and that's the interesting
That's
thing.
Semitic culture's got Islam is like the way that Catholicism is Platonic, Islam is Aristotelian.
I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. And that is why you were always going to have Christianity go north. It would have been interesting. There are two places you really would have thought Christianity had a good chance to succeed. One was Greece, well, actually three. Egypt, which it did for a long time until Islam overran it. And even today, the Copts are still viable in many ways. Greece, the history of the church, and then spreads into the Latin rites. And then Persia. And Persia just had Iran has had a really weird and unfortunate history, which hopefully will continue past this week. I mean, they're running out of water, they're under target. It looks like they're in a color revolution status. And yet, behind the Arabic script, this is a Western people. And it's like if you really start to study the history of it, it's really fascinating because the lines on the map move. If you can actually look to the steppe beyond where you had the Mongol tribes and people like that. The map of Western civilization is basically anything north of the mountains of the Caucasus. So you get into places like Persia that are on this border areas, and then you have a different philosophy. That's why you can read Vedic texts, think they're great, and then you might read a Hindu text and say, "Oh, maybe this was a descendant that was a more materialist form of something that was higher." Because you had a different group of people, which is how you might explain their class system. That you had, one group who were higher agency managing one who were lower agency. And I know no one likes those terms, but honestly, a lot of humanity's history is slave relationships where people used intelligence to collective advantage. And that's why you had things work the way they did. But I'm sort of wandering far stream here, but my point is that when you look at the origins of Christianity, it needed a very specific ferment to exist in, where there was a philosophical openness to a monotheistic God who was good, who had certain potentials that was frankly beyond the Jewish understanding, where they kind of always wanted an ethnic God of vengeance. I mean, ancient Yahweh is a fire god in a volcano. I mean, that's just the history and the archaeology of it. I'm not insulting anyone. I'm a Christian, but these are the stories that people don't know. And what you say rightly is the polytheistic roots of how these concepts emerged in relatively small, well-educated groups are really a fascinating background. But it also takes us away because we live in worlds where the religious orders that are dominant are bounded by law and settled dogma. But I think that's been the problem with the church, that dynamism has been lost. And if I have a prediction, it's that you're going to see that dynamism begin to return because people are going to begin experimenting with new combinations of beliefs that are going to open up pathways that I don't think necessarily have to contradict what's already been taught, but they'll expand on things that have been allowed to sit without practice for far too long because of institutional concerns for maintaining the orthodoxy of whatever the belief structure is.
And we will see changes in religions. I would like my personal feeling is the religious impulse is hardwired into us. When you take religion away from people, they find new religions. They just don't call them religions. I mean, the people who trust the science are, loudly atheist and will insist they're much better than religious people, but what is the logical distinction between I trust the science and I trust the Bible? I mean, the whole nature of science is if you're trusting science, you're not doing science.
Well, I guess I would say, in as much as God is infinite potential, that's a non-falsifiable statement. As much as science is the actions of man, we can show all day long how that fails. So I think the
Yeah.
better bet is the bet on the Lord. But I think you and I would share that understanding, and I think it's a shift. I honestly think this is really important. I was writing about this in my book, that we're shifting from seeing to be in the essential form versus the existential, because material reality has not got it done for too many people for too long. And I think with the change in thinking about being as a state of potential versus fixity that's going to happen, not the least of which because we keep entering virtual worlds, I think that that might actually begin to solve a lot of problems we're talking about, not in the short term, but in the longer term, because the language itself is going to lean away from the sort of control mechanisms that have proven so hollow.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's what I see when I look at these people who are hysterically insisting, I trust the science, trans women are women. The people that are yelling slogans are doing the equivalent of people who are they're praying. They're just not praying to a god. They're praying to like ideas. It's the second religiosity. We got so far away from religion, we created a generation of fanatics. I mean, secularism bred communism.
And I think that that peaked in the 60s to 80s range in terms of the education. The education system is too dysfunctional for that to continue and too discordant. So, in 10 years or so, that will go away. And now we will have new structures. And I'm not really sure what they're going to be yet. I mean, there is a degree of nihilism amongst the young, but there's also going to be a demand for a degree of openness and accountability that hasn't existed before. And so the question is going to be is, can they have an open and transparent system enough to function that still has an economy that does anything of utility, or will it just be total control vectors coming in, and that's why all this money is thrown into technology? And that's the battle we're going to see, and we've already seen in certain East Asian countries how that works. And you can look at China, people who have been kicked out of the credit score system, who are living on the floors of subways is like forgotten people, right? And I don't mean everyone lives that way, but it's really interesting to see how society treats their dregs and if their numbers are growing, like the way we have the homeless epidemic on the West Coast. And I'm not attacking the homeless by saying this. This is a failure of policy that was deliberate. There's no reason why California shouldn't be able to deal with all of its citizens very wealthily, but it's terrible policy compounding itself. And so I guess these are the things we're going to see here as we walk into 2026. But I do think we certainly have a poly crisis ongoing. We have a high potential for some sort of big event. Could happen any given day, not predicting it for any particular day. And the only advice I give to people, is thinking about these things, is to figure out where you're going to prioritize your energy, because you can watch all these things that are out there. And I certainly advise to be aware, but I also advise you not to let it become a fixation, because there's a lot of stuff now we can't do things about, and maybe focusing more of our energy on a realistic appraisal of things we can impact is something that requires more thought at this point, because the risks out there are only going to continue to grow absent a truly miraculous turn.
Yeah, we need a miracle at this point. That's the only way I see things getting better is, either a miracle or a MacGuffin. We suddenly discover like 0 point energy that's too cheap to meter. We suddenly discover like, we suddenly find God again and become like, become a functioning society instead of a loose collection of people on our phones. That's
Yeah.
pretty much the only thing, barring a miracle, it doesn't get better.
No, it doesn't. But you know what? That's when miracles tend to happen, and that's a good time to pray for it. And that's kind of where my mindset's at, because there is no political solution to these problems. I mean, you could maybe, point out the guilty actors. If you want to be really proactive about it, you could make their life a little more difficult by drawing attention to them. You could even go so far as to try to, topple the House of Cards. But I don't think anyone's putting Humpty Dumpty together again. And the problem of what's on the other side of it is the great restraint of anyone who understands the contours of the problem. And in that sense, I don't think anything's changed since, I first started seriously looking at this probably 20 years ago. And I'm just amazed by how much inertia kind of keeps things going. But now we've reached the point where so many people are just not even meeting their basic needs anymore. That the next pause that happens that allows people the breath to get away from the work that's tormenting them, people are not going to come back to anything that resembled normalcy after that. You're not going to be able to tell people to go back to work, because you're just not going to, because it's just not worth it. And I think a lot of people are pretty close to that point now. I think we're going to see a lot of people lose their jobs as we get into this new year here, because there were a lot of people holding out, as there are across sectors every year, for what's going to happen in the holiday season. And I don't think Black Friday was black for anyone. I think it was Black and Blue Friday. And I don't think a lot was sold, because people are busy spending all their money on their rent, their electric bills. And the other thing we didn't talk about, we could, not my area of expertise, but the exploding prices of healthcare for anyone who has any need in those areas, and the truly atrocious rules that exist for how debts are financed and handled, where people don't feel like they have the ability to survive if they've fallen off the cliff. But as you and I both know, they can cancel you, but you don't go away. And so what happens when those numbers become large enough? That's going to be a story of 2026. We're going to see, if we get to an election, a Democratic landslide, because no Republican's going to vote for this party, and that will then lead to even more chaos in Washington. So if you have means, if you have wherewithal, get the hell out of the way, and
Yeah.
wherever you are, ask the Lord to lead you out. And, maybe the evangelicals will prove right. Maybe we get raptured out. That'd be a nice little thing. It's
I
not
mean,
in the Bible, but hey, God can do miracles.
I expect at some point the the party that's in charge is going to is going to try to Menshevik the party that's out of charge. That could be, either Trump or Vance or whoever comes after, if it's a person voting, are going hard on the Democrats, like starting to arrest people, people starting to fall out of windows the way they do in Russia, that kind of thing. Or it could be the other side. And what scares me is a significant proportion of the supporters of both sides will cheer when it happens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and you know what? I hate to say it, I'd probably be amongst them. And only because it's not going to get better. If things aren't going to get better, the least you end up thinking is maybe they come down with you. And that's kind of where we're at in the story now. Because you're right. If Trump was competent, he could have made himself a Caesar. He's not. He's owned by some other interests. Vance, I
That's,
mean,
yeah.
I don't know. Vance, maybe the teal people behind him. What's his
It's
face?
like, Mr.
Yarvin.
Trump, Herod took orders from Caesar. Why are you taking orders from Herod? I'll leave it there.
Well, he's living his pilot truth. You know what I mean? He really is. But I think that we might see Vance make a push, because the tech, bros are behind him. And if they were going to do it, honestly, the best time for them to do it would be in 27, because you want to get past that midterm so you can theoretically have 3 terms lined up. Because the first rule of being a good dictator, as Caesar Augustus showed us, is you become first citizen. You never call yourself the power you actually wield. That's just basic, straight up Machiavelli. And I think you might see a move in that direction because if you see the Democrats take Congress, you might see Republicans get scared again enough where they might say, okay, we're going to need some sort of stronger power now. And I think you're right. At some point, someone's going to make a play for the throne. And if the right doesn't, the left will figure a way to grind out their own version of Bolshevism on whatever terms they think is appropriate. But as always is the case, whether it's the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, the capitalists, or whatever, it's going to be the same crew running the show. And the reason why is the one thing that's north of money is narrative, which is why getting right with the word, getting right in the word, bringing people to Christ, or even, what, I know you have an international audience. I mean, even if people follow the rules of Allah, I think you'll end up in the same conclusion about who needs to be opposed and what needs to be stopped. And that now has to be the battle because those are the people who are running the show. And you could say there's other people involved. I have no problem with that. Let's grab them all then. Yeah. That's fine.
I mean, I've got to go back through the manuscript again and try rewrite it. It's been rejected by a couple publications, a manuscript on the 7 deadly sins. And one of the things I noticed is every major religious tradition agrees on those 7 deadly sins.
Yeah.
It's like we agree on about 80% of our stuff. That was one of the things where I think, anybody follow a religion faithfully and you're all going to come to a lot of the same conclusions. There is a higher power. There are certain behaviors that are bad. There are certain behaviors that are good. You should strive to do the good behaviors and not do the bad behaviors. I mean, I don't want to get into the Catholics call it the heresy of indifferentism, saying, well, every religion's just as good as any other. Obviously, I think Catholicism is one of the best branches of Christianity. I wouldn't be a Catholic if I didn't. But, I don't, that doesn't mean I can't agree to disagree with people who are not Catholic or even who are not Christian, and say, okay, what can I learn from you? What can you learn from me?
The thing that we have to watch for is when people come into our ranks who turn us from what we should believe. I think that's really been the danger. The fact that Zionism was able to latch on to this, or the fact that, secularism was able to latch on. I mean, the thing about having a claim to truth is you hold your claim to truth and you stand up for it. And I think a lot of people have seen the benefits that has come to the Islamic world for doing that and their communities as sub-communities in the West. And I think a lot of people have drawn that conclusion that now would be a better time to build that connection where we say we stand here on the faith and we stand against things like gluttony, because honestly this is the thing, like the reasonable ask is that if you don't want the 7 deadly sins, we'll use your term, it's perfect, in your community, don't promote it in our community. Because if I were to look at who promotes the big companies of pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth, well, I could tell you what, you'd be playing that music again.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like, and get rid of usury. Yeah. That's the other one. I mean, it's like the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews among fellow Jews all agreed that usury was a bad thing.
I would argue that usury is a case of gluttony, maybe a little bit of taste of envy with it too, but or greed. You can put however you want, but I think it's definitely included. It's a compound sin, let's say, and but that ultimately, this is why I come back to what I said at the top of the show. We're going to have to fight the bank. I mean, if you really want to have the right battle, the bank is who has to be fought because it's the illusion of money. We talk about how we're poor, but people ask this question in all seriousness, who do we owe all this money to?
I think we're currently paying something like 25% of the GDP is going to not the national debt, to interest on the national debt. It got up to about 30 to 35% in France, and we all know how that ended.
Well, I say let them eat matzo balls.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like this is not going to end well. And, to my Jewish listeners, I have no quarrel with any individual person, but, you know, if things get bad for us, they will get a lot worse for you. And I'm saying that like not as a threat, that's as a simple statement of fact. It's like, unfortunately, every time you have a crisis, pretty much anywhere, somebody gets around to blaming the Jews for it.
Well, I
Whether
mean,
that's
if we're gonna be honest about it, the Zionists, if people make this case, and I certainly would consider a broader case, but don't make the case rightly. The Zionists basically use Jewish populations elsewhere as sort of a political agitprop, right? They're completely shameless about it. Now, I think that I've seen a number of people in that community who have spoken out very vigorously against the things that are happening, and I give them credit for it. I will say, though, from the perspective of a Christian, if your whole religion is based on basically, and I know they're not going to like this, but Judaism is a heresy of Christianity. Christ completed the faith, he completed the works that were in there. That's why they switched going back to the Talmud, because they weren't very happy that the Septuagint got answered through the things that Christ did. But whatever you make of that, people have the right to be heretics. That's fine. The Ultimately, the whole Judaic religion, as presently constituted, is not the wonderful story that evangelicals believe of the time of David, but is the cynical creation of rabbis in the centuries after Christianity had really taken root, who had decided, no, we are a special people. We want to be back in the seat of priority. And the fact that Jesus wanted to save everyone meant he couldn't have been one of us, because why would we do that? And that is a very cruel, harsh way to say it, but we need to be able to have conversations without bullshit. And I always say the cure for everyone who has an ailment with their own, living is in Christ. I don't exclude anyone from that covenant and that promise, because to do so would be to put my own soul at peril, because they deserve Christ too. We all do. Not because we are good, but because he is. But Christians have not been willing to say that for years because they were being politically correct. The fact that I am saying it as bluntly as I am here, knowing the consequences of that, is just the leading indicator of how much of a sea change is coming. And it's going to be linguistic, where we're going to say, you claim you have truth, you claim you have the right to have this. It is not automatically given to you. Prove that you can belong, which is going to have two parts. You have to make some sense, and you have to act civilized. Because if you don't act civilized when weapons become this much stronger, someone's going to have to be put down like a rabid dog. And it doesn't matter who it is, it's whoever behaves that way. And if you look at the world right now, the people who are living in the Eastern Mediterranean have put themselves in a very, very dangerous spot.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know the one of the reasons like we lost the we had to get out of Vietnam was people started seeing images of the bloodshed on TV. You think you're going to get away with Gaza in a time when everybody is carrying a video camera in their pocket and they can upload images of the atrocities you're committing.
Yeah, I mean, and people can't unsee those things. They stick with you. I mean, I'm sure you've seen many things. I've seen many things. I kind of wish I wouldn't have seen as many things as I've seen, to be honest.
Yeah.
You
No,
know?
it's I just, you know, you need to like the best time to stop this fight would have been immediately after the Hamas attack. The second best time would be, today.
Yeah,
It's
I think the
they
problem
can't
is
win
that you
this
have.
war because even if they win this war, they've lost the hearts of the world.
Well, it's an interesting bet, right? If you were willing to be a full-on pariah state, North Korea was treated that way a long time. They made it work. I don't know. I
The
don't know. I tell you
main
what, though, it's interesting.
difference being is they had an understanding with China and okay, Israel's got nuclear bombs. The problem is so does Pakistan, and if Pakistan has them, that means that any Gulf oil sheik can have one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is I think the problem is that Saudi Arabia has never really been invested in the Arabs, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but
Saudi Arabia's been invested in the House of Saud.
correct. So that being the case, I mean, let's just all right. So as our last analysis, because I know we're coming up on the end here, let's take a look at the Middle East. So interesting things have been happening that people haven't talked about. The recognition of Somaliland as a separate country from Somalia. You know, you think with everything happening in Somalis in America, we'd hear about that, but we don't. And Israel was the first country to recognize them. Why? To keep an eye on Yemen, where the Saudis are fighting Yemen right now, which is kind of interesting. And at the same time, you've seen a new sort of deeper alliance. They were meeting to formalize this between the Greeks, the Cypriots, and the Israelis. And you know that's over Syria versus the Turks, and Turkey has a heavy influence in Libya. Egypt's kind of a wild card. Their government's pro-Israel, but their people hate them. So now we're starting to have entangling alliances in just the wrong sort of way for a World War II type or World War One type conflagration. And now you have what looks to all reason wise like a color revolution maybe being tried in Iran right after, you see Trump and Netanyahu sit there and party and actually auction off a 10-minute drawing of Jesus for $2.75 million. That's one worth checking out if you haven't.
Yeah, that was like, you know, Netanyahu should be getting arrested anytime he leaves the state of Israel at this point. They've committed enough war crimes for it. We're at the point where we're covering up for a genocide on behalf of people, speaking in my capacity as a Christian, people who despise me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, at least I can say for the Muslims, they believe, Jesus was the greatest of the prophets before Muhammad. They called like the Virgin Mary the best of women. That's not quite the way they put it in the Talmud. I'll leave it there.
Well, I mean, and that's kind of the interesting thing. I wonder. I think that should be worked towards. I think Christians and Muslims should come to terms with each other. I think if we did, it would become even more obvious than it already is who's causing the problems, and then deal with that. Israel needs to act like a responsible nation if it wants to exist. If it doesn't want to do that, that's fine. If it's going to act like a rabid dog, sooner or later, even if it's a non-state actor, someone is going to do something because that's the way these things inevitably go. Because, I mean, it's just the difference in populations. What are you going to do? You could build your Greater Israel Project. You're going to run all the Arabs out of Damascus and out of Cairo and the Lebanese out.
The last time you invaded Lebanon, you got 800 meters in for a week.
Yep.
That's really not a good start to the Greater Israel Project, fellas.
Right.
Because you think, okay, you 800 meters into Lebanon. After Lebanon, you get into Syria. After Syria, you're like, you want to take a big chunk of Iraq. Yeah, good luck with that. Oh, yes, and
yet,
you want to take Egypt.
And Bibi's trying to do it because the minute he stops, his career is over. So he's all in. I mean, I don't know what all the details are behind it, but I mean, that's what you have to keep an eye on. I mean, even now, today, there's talking about more demonstrations in Iran. And I'm like, I mean, they look fake, obviously. But on the other hand, I'm sure things are terrible in Iran because they're kind of terrible everywhere,
Yeah,
And
the
how many
sanctions
people have
are
they bought?
hurting Iran. Iran has a very, prices of housing are expensive. They're dealing with inflation. Staples are hard, basically they're dealing with what we've got here, only worse.
What's interesting is they say the areas in Iran that are having the most violence are in the Kurdish regions. You know, I'll tell you, it's an old lie, but it's one we remember during the Gulf War stuff. If Israel went to the Kurds and said, look, at the end of this, we'll make sure you have a homeland in Iraq and in Iran. And if they get involved in Turkey also, I could see the Kurds maybe going along with that. They wouldn't listen to that from the U.S., but Israel's just dark enough and the Kurds have been through just enough crap that you kind of wonder if they might not make that deal.
Yeah, I mean, oh, I'm sure Israel is engaged in all kinds of subterfuge, sedition, espionage, etc., trying to get a greater Israel. I mean, geopolitically speaking, the country is the size of Israel's the size of New Jersey. B,
What do you think about the relationship between Putin and Israel? Because
I
that's the
mean,
heart of it, isn't it?
I think Putin does seem to have I don't know whether Putin has Jewish ancestry. It is entirely possible he does. There were, you know, just like it would be no more surprising if Putin had Jewish ancestry than to find out that somebody who lived in the in the New York metro area whose last name was Franzioni had like an Ashkenazic grandparent.
That's true.
It's I mean, so it's not that, but I mean, Putin
A lot of
seems
Russians seem to think that he isn't serious about winning. That's why I say that. I spend some time keeping up on that. And the suggestions made, and a lot of the people who live there in Israel are of Russian extraction. I know it's a difficult and tricky relationship because here's the thing. If the Israelis know that the Russians, because they have a good relationship with Putin that they trust for reasons that are beyond politics, are not going to intervene in Iran, and Iran kind of falls, I mean, things get so crazy there. You kind of can do the death by a thousand cuts sort of romance of the three kingdoms strategy where you just grab little globs here and there. And you might see that happen. And if Israel was willing to kind of play their cards just the right way with this, and they're willing to risk a whole region level war, which frankly they seem willing to do because they seem to have calculated that they won't survive long term unless they can drag in their hostile, or I should say, their captive Western politicians. Maybe they decide to throw the dice at it, and other people hedge their bets, and that's why you see all these countries offering golden parachute citizenships all of a sudden, where you go down there, you spend even the United States, you get one of those gold things for $1 million. That's your insurance policy if it goes badly in Israel. You know, we see that happening. It's happening in Argentina. It's happening in Chile. It's happening in a number of countries. In fact, they're starting to kick them out of Thailand. It's kind of interesting how it's gotten so badly there. If you want to check out something not a lot of people are talking about, but this is the problem, and this is also the nature of the world. We used to think of peoples and polities as groups and set borders. That world has gone away. Working online, internet communities, it's just not going to exist that way anymore. And then now we're looking at a new sort of tribalism where the world they're imagining, I think, is probably closer to where most people are going to end up. Not in terms of the violence and the awfulness and the institutional control, but in the idea of us and them that are fundamentally different than how we think about it today, because that's already changing.
yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking here, my boss, my client, I have two of the clients I work for are in Canada. Like the people I work there are, I believe they're Lebanese Canadians, and there's a Vietnamese Canadian. I'm working for another company now where the woman I do most of my interfacing with is in South Africa. I should mention the Canadian company. Our big client is a company in Dubai.
Yeah, I mean,
And
and
that's pretty much
your
the way it
welfare
is.
is
I
now
write
global.
around, yeah, I'm global. I mean, I'm talking to somebody. I've got another client I'm working on right now. I believe they are also out of they're from Lebanon. I think they may be in I think they're in Dubai.
Sure, and I mean, and global means different things, right? It can mean that you are the center of your orbit. Trump certainly seems to act that way. There are other leaders who act that way around the world. And we will actually see that sort of area evolve where, because we have these sort of disconnects and connections. I mean, because the lines in the world, even when we look at certain things, we look at BRICS on one side and the West on the other, but they're doing too much business with each other to just break it up. It just, I mean, they maybe be wiser if they did, but it just isn't happening.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So,
Yeah, we're just I mean, I think we're seeing on the one hand more globalism, with the internet for as long as the internet lasts, and more tribalism. I mean, that's a lot of it's virtual tribalism, but as things get bad, I expect you're going to start seeing more like real world tribalism.
At some point, someone somewhere will take over something with force. It'll probably start with little paramilitaries, or it might start with local politics, but there'll be no-go zones. And the rest of it's just going to be a question of who can project force well enough, and will the state be able to? And with the American state, let's be honest, the American empire wants one thing. It wants foot soldiers for its regime to go overseas for the viceroys. And that's it. And whatever happens at home, honestly, we're just kind of left to fend.
I
We're
mean,
out
we
here near
already
Twitter.
are seeing like California is like Californian politicians are talking about arresting ICE agents. You have in meanwhile people in red states, are talking about ignoring like orders the next time next time the Democratic office goes blue. I mean, we're already getting to the point where people are saying, maybe we don't have to listen to the government. What happens when people stop listening to the government and it becomes clear the government doesn't have the power to enforce its orders?
That's when you end up listening to three different governments because they all have more force projection than you do. You
Yeah,
know,
but I mean, I see that coming already. I mean, I'm seeing.
that's it. And then someone will see if who can put the authority back together. And you would think that eventually there will be congregations that form on more coherent bases that will occupy a certain geography, because you would think that at some point you'd need that labor. But there is an alternate vision of that where maybe you have a future that is more like I don't know, like the old Alpha Centauri game, where you have factions form across borders and that act that way, because we see that as well. So it's really kind of up in the air where it's going to go, and a lot of it depends on whether we have to divert human energy back to labor for survival purposes, and who does and who doesn't. Because as sad as it is to say, whoever doesn't have to is going to have a huge advantage, and others may survive. They may be left alone. They may be fighting, but ultimately that's what's going to kind of determine who wins. And they're fighting over that because they think they can get an AI that can take over every other one, and all those messes. But it'll definitely make for an exciting 2026. We're on a new one cycle as these things are counted, and I kind of look forward to watching it from my far distant vantage point here in the very, very far corner of the country. So those are kind of my views for 2026. But is there anything big you see coming that we haven't covered you want to put out there?
I mean, I'm expecting we're going to see more of the same in 2026, but I also think there's a non-trivial possibility we're going to wind up getting hit with a black swan, another COVID, another 9/11, something. And this time, I'm not really sure. Our government expended a lot of energy and a lot of goodwill on COVID. Do they have that energy? Do they have the force projection? Do they have the goodwill to deal with the population if, say, we do have the economic collapse in 2026?
They do not, so they're going to need a hell of a good enemy. I don't know
That's
what would unite people again, though. I have no idea.
I don't either, but yeah, I think I have to start supper, and I suspect you might as well. So why don't we call this a day? Thank you again. You have not been on for a while. I am always glad to have you on. And to all our listeners, we're really happy. We're really glad you showed up. And all I got to say is,
your soul is mine. Fate